I'm Rose Aguilar, and this is Your Call. Today, we continue our series on Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation-led plan that would dismantle the administrative state and ensure arch-conservative rule for decades to come. It would affect all aspects of life and would be implemented by expanding presidential powers and eliminating federal agencies. Paul Dans, the former chief of staff during the Trump administration and director of Project 2025, stepped down after Donald Trump attempted to distance himself from the authoritarian plan. It's just getting so much media attention. On Twitter, Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, said Project 2025 will continue, quote, our efforts to build a personnel apparatus for policymakers of all levels, federal, state, and local, end quote. Over the past few weeks, we've done shows about the 110 far-right groups that have worked on Project 2025. We talked about how it would alter all aspects of life and its ominous plan to, quote, restore a culture of life in America. You can find those shows at kalw.org. Click News, then Your Call. Today, we are discussing Project 2025's plans for immigration. Project 2025 targets immigrants and anyone who looks like one, according to America's Voice. The plan paves the way for mass family separation, eliminates family-based immigration and DACA, allows immigration raids on schools, hospitals, and religious institutions, attacks legal immigration, and much more. Donald Trump is trying to distance himself from the plan, and yet, at the recent Republican National Convention, he promised to carry out those plans as his supporters waved mass deportation now signs. He said the Republican platform promises to launch the largest deportation operation in the history of the country. Joining us to talk about all of this are two guests. Zachary Mueller is Senior Research Director for America's Voice, an organization that builds the public support and the political will needed to enact policy changes that secure freedom and opportunity for immigrants in the U.S. Hi, Zachary. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Great to have you. Cecilia Esterline is Immigration Research Analyst at the Niskanen Center. Did I say that right, Cecilia?
You got it. That's right.
Great. Thank you. Niskanen Center, an independent think tank that works on issues like economic insecurity, climate change, unaffordable housing, and the dysfunctional immigration system. Hi, Cecilia. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, I want to ask both of you about recent developments with Paul Dans, director of Project 2025, stepping down after Donald Trump attempted to distance himself from the authoritarian plan. I mean, the fact is the plan is getting so much coverage, even in People magazine. And yet what is in this plan and what we heard at the Republican National Convention is not that different. And it's important to remember that his supporters were waving mass deportation now signs. So, Zachary, what are your thoughts on this? Are there many differences between what's in Project 2025 and what we are hearing from Donald Trump?
No, I think there's very little difference. And I think what we can see from the recent developments is actually an attempt, a weak one at that, where they have realized that their radical agenda is not actually popular with the vast majority of the American people. And so heading into an extremely important election, well, they're going to kind of throw some smoke and mirrors up to try to hide that radical, unpopular, devastating agenda for working families across this country. They're going to try to hide that a bit before and hide the details of that heading into the election. But I think what we can see and what we know is that the personnel, the policies, and the will continues to move forward with this sort of radical agenda explicitly on immigration and really what that means. And kind of the sum total of what they're proposing isn't a conversation about how to manage migration flows for the best interest of the American people, but instead a radical rethinking of citizenship and who gets to be an American. And so I think that kind of policy of mass deportations, detention camps, family separation, etc. Those ideas are not popular with the American people. And so I think we're starting to see the Donald Trump campaign and even through Project 2025 get a little concerned with all the attention to their very weird plan.
Cecilia, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Zachary has said. And I think that it's important to note that like Project 2025 is not just refreshing term one ideas, but they have really carefully laid out a lot of very, ideas that really work well together to serve this very narrow pool of interest. And it's just not an interest that echoes with the vast majority of Americans, like Zachary said. Even within, the Conservative Party, people who really want to stick to traditional conservative values of decentralization, of focusing on business growth and development, this plan doesn't do that. It centralizes government in a very politicized federal government, and it hurts businesses that really rely on labor, including immigrant labor, to be able to function in our labor market and economy.
Can you both just remind us what stood out for you the most under 4 years of Trump? It's actually pretty remarkable when you think about it, that family separation is hardly talked about right now. I mean, the election is getting 24/7 coverage, and you just don't hear much about family separation. I was curious to see if I can find any updates about, and this is just, you can't even fathom this, of the children who still remain separated from their families. I was able to find a piece in the Washington Post. Maybe you both have updates. This piece was by Philip Bump in May. The headline, 6 years later, 1,400 children remain separated from their families. More than 3,200 children were pulled away from their families at the border. They've been reunified. But to think, Zachary, that 1,400 children to this day still have not been able to find their families?
Yeah, I think, that is, I think, what we can think and remember about the Trump administration when they were in power. They intentionally created a plan to try to do maximum cruelty, which is to rip apart families, put children in cages, and separate them and create that level of trauma under the false belief that somehow enacting that sort of cruelty would stop people fleeing from their lives, seeking the safety and refuge of the United States, believing in, the symbol of the Statue of Liberty. And they did that on purpose and did not keep track records of these children. And that is why they continue to be separated to this day. Now, I think we've seen from the Biden administration an effort to lean in to try to reunite those families with the power of the government. But I think what is really important for us to think about in this moment is that what we saw in the first term of the Trump administration is going to be just but a sample of what they are proposing to move forward this time around. I think what we're dealing with isn't, hey, we've done this rodeo before, but we're actually facing something distinctly new, something distinctly different here. Because unlike before, as we see in Project 2025, there's a plan, there's a will, and then there's the personnel to execute this plan to move forward. And what we say around mass family separation is what the number of children that were separated at the border under the first administration. What they are proposing here is to do on a massive scale across the country, also with American families. So we might want to think about this as a mother who has a U.S. citizen child. What is being proposed in, the agenda that is being put forward around immigration is to find that mother, round her up, put her in a camp, and then deport her. And then that is what we're talking about here. This is kind of the family separation we're talking about that leaves U.S. citizen children who may come home from school to find that their mom, their parents are no longer there without any real question or concern about what to do next, how that child might find their parents, and deported to who knows where, especially because many of the folks that are being targeted here or being asked to be that are on the table are the 80% of the undocumented community that lives in the United States who has been here for over a decade. They are our friends, they are our family, they are our neighbors, they are our coworkers. They're not just talking about new arrivals here. The family separation plan is national, and it is for people that are deeply embedded and long settled into our communities. And so I think about the past administration and the horrors of that family separation. I think we need to be really clear about the choice and what is on offer and what is being put forward as a signature promise from the Republican Party in this moment about what they are saying about mass family separation across the country.
Just to think that if a family was separated and their child was say 5, the child is now 11 and they have not seen them in 6 years. I mean, you just can't even imagine. Cecilia, what would you add? What really stood out for you under 4 years of Trump? And what Zachary, I think, is talking about, and what has been a theme on the Project 2025 shows we've been doing, is that the Trump administration, based on what we're learning from Project 2025, is going to fire more than 50,000 civil servants and replace them with MAGA loyalists. So you're not going to have people this time around stand up and say, actually, we cannot do that, or that is illegal. So can you talk a bit about that? What struck you during the Trump administration, and what do you think, what concerned you the most about what would happen if he wins again?
Sure. I agree with what Zachary said, that this isn't just a repeat of the first term. And I think that it's important to recognize one of the most catastrophic things that he did perhaps in his first term that we are likely to see in a second term is this politicization of the federal government, which we saw maybe a taste of a little bit in the first term with the introduction of so many judges. But realistically, what he proposes in a second term and what is proposed in Project 2025 is a much more significant politicization of the federal government, that every level of decision making, just removing people who have been career civil servants and replacing them with those who are loyal to the administration's agenda. And so Project 2025 has this personnel database that they are building to ensure that there are people that align with those ideals that can be ready to fill in those roles that Trump would like to fill with individuals who align with those political priorities. That's from the bottom to the top of an organization that needs to maintain some continuity of governance in a transition period. Instead, managers and leaders at every level of the government would be replaced with those who are loyal to it. And I think that this creates, like many of the other things that were proposed in Project 2025, a sort of inefficiency in the government and barriers to just processing. So when we see this in legal immigration, it means that people are getting slower renewals if they can even get their renewal. People will fall out of status, ultimately creating new undocumented populations, even if they're here legally, but they just can't get their renewal in time. And also applying for new statuses. People and businesses who need to bring people here, again, they want to be able to do it if there's so many inefficiencies created. And I think that they used that somewhat in the first administration to slow down or have lower rates of approval or just create kind of backlogs. But I think that what they plan to do in a second term is actually to weaponize that even further, and in order to use it to cut off entire categories of immigration based on backlogs or workflow management tactics that they have described in Project 2025 that really aren't workflow management tactics at all, but really a way to cut off categories of immigration.
That is Cecilia Esterline, immigration research analyst at the Niskanen Center, an independent think tank. Zachary Mueller is senior research director for America's Voice, an organization that works to build support and changes that secure freedom and opportunity for immigrants in the United States. Today, we continue our series on Project 2025 by talking about the plan for immigration. America's Voice says Project 2025 targets immigrants and anyone who looks like one. The Niskanen Center says under a second Trump administration, immigration policies would be far more complex and destructive than previously reported. If you have any questions or comments about the Trump administration's plan for immigration, Project 2025's plans for immigration, We'd love to hear from you. The toll-free number is 866-798-8255, 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. Well, we know that, according to Project 2025, a Trump administration would hire a number of MAGA loyalists who do not stand up and say you cannot do that. But some of the people that have been with him all along and are part of Project 2025, we should talk about because we know their records. So, Zachary, America's Voice highlights 4 of the authors. One of them I've never heard of. I wonder if others have. Thomas Homan. This is Trump's former acting ICE director, who's a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation and is listed as a Project 2025 contributor. You all write that along with Stephen Miller, he's been one of the most vocal proponents of a mass deportation vision. During a recent gathering of far-right activists, Thomas Homan pledged to make good on the campaign to round up millions of immigrants. He said, quote, "Trump comes back in January, I'll be on his heels coming back, and I will run the biggest deportation force this country has ever seen. They ain't seen SHIT yet. Wait until 2025. So can you tell us more about Tom Homan? You also report that when he was acting ICE director, the arrests of undocumented immigrants with no criminal record surged over 170% in 2017.
Yeah, so for folks who don't know Tom Homan, so The Atlantic did a very long, deep dive into family separation to kind of draw us into the conversation that we were having a little bit earlier. So they talk about him as being the intellectual father of family separation. And so this is a man who has really thought about the plan and was pushing for the implementation of that kind of family separation policy that we were talking about earlier, that was separating thousands of families and creating that trauma in the Trump administration. And Trump himself and Tom Homan is quick to tell you that if Trump wins, he is going to be back in that administration to be able to carry out the sort of plan that is outlined in Project 2025. And I think this is important for listeners to know and to understand that, you know, we've seen Trump in the public eye for many years now. And this is a man who sometimes gets quite distracted with new shiny objects. But I think what we can see here in the Project 2025 plan and the folks that are around it, there is a committed sense of individuals who are eager to engage in the sort of mass deportation, thinking of our American immigration system to limit legal immigration, to cut off pathways, and to do massive roundups, creating a show me your papers force to go across the country to start these roundups. And Tom Homan is going to be eager to be able to lead that effort. And I think it's also important to know that it's not just Homan himself. I think there was a report in the USA Today that was released earlier this week looking at some of the other contributors to the immigration section, people that work for hate groups, people that have been drummed out of public life because they said, like this guy, Richwine, who wrote a PhD, Jason Richwine, he wrote a PhD thesis claiming that immigrants and Hispanics are lower IQ, kind of pushing a biological racist idea. Other people have been associated, including Homan, pushing the white nationalist, anti-Semitic great replacement theory, the idea that there is a cabal of elites, of Democrats intentionally facilitating an invasion of the country. Like, these are the people who are promoting, who are rubbing shoulders with active white nationalists and other people who espouse bigoted ideas, who wrote Project 2025, and who are in line to sign up for the second Trump administration, if that were to be the case. And so I think there's the old saying, personnel is policy. And I think with people like Tom Homan and many others that are aligned with Project 2025, that policy from that personnel creates a really dangerous white nationalist vision for the country.
We have done shows about Stephen Miller, and I'm sure most of our listeners are familiar with him. You all at America's Voice write that Several are on Project 2025's advisory board, including America First Legal, the extremist xenophobic group led by white nationalist and former Trump administrative advisor Stephen Miller. Miller is the mastermind of Trump's mass deportation plan. We know Miller means what he says because he was principal architect of the administration's cruelest immigration policies, including the discriminatory Muslim ban, the attempt to end the popular and successful DACA program, and subject hundreds of thousands of dreamers to deportation. Trump administration figures that helped Miller advance this horrific agenda are now key figures behind Project 2025. What role does Stephen Miller play in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's like you articulated. He's a organizer, collecting, moving these ideas forward, and is really going to be able to lead the effort to execute the ideas that are inside of Project 2025. And I think, we've talked a little bit about the details here today, but I think what is really important for folks to know is that with Stephen Miller at the helm, controlling and pushing the immigration agenda that he has been zealously focused in on for the last several years. What this means for regular working people across the country, regardless of their immigration status, is that this might mean that your child, second grade teacher who may be a DACA recipient is going to no longer be able to show up for work because Stephen Miller's Show Me Your Paper force has rounded her up and put her in a detention camp for deportation. It means that the home health care aides that your mother might rely upon, who happens to be a temporary protected status holder, it may no longer be there to provide that level of care. It might mean that there is a massive increase in inflation at the grocery store because the undocumented immigrants who are doing the work in the fields and agricultural places are being rounded up. And so this isn't just about immigrants or immigrant communities. This is a widespread concern for all working families across America about really what this means and what is being proposed, where somebody like Stephen Miller is actively saying that he would like to tap red states' National Guard to send them into blue states to be able to conduct these sorts of mass roundups, this kind of show me your papers force. And so what I think is really important when it is different from when Stephen Miller was in the administration the last time is, again, one, they have a very detailed plan about how to execute this moving forward with the anti-immigrant agenda and the will to exist there. And also, as you've mentioned, there is very little in the impediments to stop them. And so whether or not they will be able to fulfill all of their desired and stated proposals that are outlined in Project 2025, that's yet to be determined, but they are committed to pushing and trying to be as successful and round up as many people as possible.
Before we go to break, Cecilia, in the long paper the Niskanen Center has put out about what Project 2025 would do around immigration, you all write that, this is an exhaustive paper. It's 920 pages. It includes over 175 immigration provisions. There is so much in here about immigration. And it's really interesting. I'm so glad you all make this point because Project 2025 is now getting so much more attention. I often cite People magazine because I just never thought I'd see Project 2025 in People magazine. That said, you all write, while there is little doubt that a second term for Trump would be grim for immigrants, the headlines do not capture the depth of the proposed changes or the lengths the administration would go to implement them. So can you talk about media coverage specifically of what is in Project 2025 around immigration?
Yeah, I've been grateful that, since we put out the paper, it's changed a bit and it has gotten a bit more attention. But at one point, the prospect of a second Trump term was simply focused on things that he might yell at a rally or things that he used to excite a crowd. But in reality, those don't even cover the depth of everything that he intends to do. And we've seen in the past where he's said things at rallies and then his campaign, the policy people, as we were just discussing, the importance of the people who are actually implementing the policy, his campaign has walked those statements back. And so when he uses this rhetoric and then the reporting focuses only on that rhetoric, there's a lot of the complexity and some of the really intricate policies that they intend to implement and that they have the ability to implement without any congressional involvement or judicial oversight. The things that they are able to do, even to the legal immigration system, that sometimes aren't captured by the headlines or by the media reporting, because immigration is understandably a very complex policy area, but there's some very intricate policy changes that they intend to do that will be really catastrophic, not just for immigrants, but for American citizens as well, that are used as sort of immigrant adjacent or immigrant proxy policies that can really end up hurting American citizens, whether we're talking about federal financial aid or housing subsidies, anything of that type, where we see that this could also have a detrimental effect on American citizens. And some of that is not captured when you're only focusing on the things that maybe Trump shouts at rallies and doesn't cover the intricate policies that they have really outlined in this report.
Right. Well, we'll talk about some of those after a break. That is Cecilia Esterline, immigration research analyst at the Niskanen Center, an independent think tank that works on a variety of issues, including what they call the dysfunctional immigration system. Zachary Mueller is senior research director for America's Voice, an organization that builds the political will needed to enact policy changes that secure freedom and opportunity for immigrants in the U.S. Today on Your Call, we continue our series on Project 2025 by talking about its plans for immigration. You can give us a call at 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. We'll be back after this. This is Your Call. I'm Rose Aguilar. Coming up tomorrow, we will discuss the Democratic Party. Is it still the Clinton-Obama party, or is it turning into something else? Minnesota Governor and potential VP pick Tim Walz has been proudly touting policies like universal school lunches, gun control, and universal higher education. Will we see the Democratic Party embrace widely popular policies like these? What are your thoughts? What do you want to see from the Democratic Party? We hope you can join us tomorrow. If you have a show idea or a guest idea, you can email your call at kalw.org. Today, we continue our series on Project 2025 by talking about its plans for immigration. We're joined today by Zachary Mueller, Senior Research Director for America's Voice, and Cecilia Esterline, Immigration Research Analyst at the Niskanen Center. You can join us at 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. And let's hear from a few callers. Let's go to Lex in San Francisco. Hi, Lex. Welcome to the show, and thanks for holding.
Hi, thank you. As far as the media, I really think we need to start calling this fascism. Just call it out for what it is. It's playbook, it's textbook. There's so many endless examples. And then Project 2025 it basically is like a blueprint for obliterating how law works as we know it. And to your comment, personnel is policy, I'd like to also say that judges are also policy. He's appointed so many judges when he was in office. And we're already seeing what his judges are doing as far as just wrecking law. And, logic, argument doesn't matter anymore. Facts don't matter anymore. And then this thing about an example of just destroying law, this thing of immigrants and people who look like immigrants, right? That's just like carte blanche for whatever they want to do to whoever they want to do. And I also think we should start calling these detention camps concentration camps, because they're giving themselves endless openings to do whatever they want to whoever they want, and it's just going to continue. It's bad enough, to any immigrant or supposedly someone who looks like an immigrant. Well, everyone here looks like an immigrant, right? Unless you're Native American. And then if they're going by the color of people's skin, they're going to deport Native Americans. Is that what they're going to do? I mean, it's so insane, this whole system. And I'm so tired of the media, not you, of course, but so much of the media acting like this is somehow a legitimate candidate. I mean, this is so extreme and so crazy, and I just feel like people really need to be naming it for what it is and calling out facts and putting facts at the center of things and saying that facts matter. Because it's just like we're just engaging him as if he's, I mean, CNN anyway, I could go on and on. It's just so frustrating and so enraging.
I hear you, Lex. I know exactly what you're talking about with some of this media coverage, especially the cable shows. Zachary, do you want to jump in there? Cecilia talked about media coverage before the break, and Lex and so many other listeners are critical of media coverage of Trump, just many trying to treat him like any other candidate. What do you think so far about coverage of immigration?
I think this is a difficulty that is wide ranging, and I wish I had the quick fix for that answer. But I do think there's a couple things to think about here. One is the amount of pressure because of the focus on how devastating and radical Project 2025 has been. And I think, you were mentioning about this even showing up in People magazine, but that is because there's a larger conversation where people are talking about how important this is to put pressure on editors and at all different kind of media outlets to be able to cover this stuff. And so I think that kind of external pressure to cover the importance of Project 2025 resulted in them having to, clam up a bit and try to pull back their policies. And so I do think while there is plenty of frustration, I think, and I feel that as well, I think we can also see that, there is something here that when we talk collectively, as people across this country, whether that in the different outlets and spaces that we can, I think elevating those important issues, that does matter for folks to be able to see what is actually on offer for us to be able to make a decision on in our democratic process. And what is on offer is we see a radical policy. Now, I think the thing that I am concerned about in some of the media coverage, again, is also a bit of that of treating some of this stuff with kid gloves, but also I think, as Cecilia mentioned, about a bit more of the details about what is being proposed here. And I think we can think even about the presidential debate where Trump and then Biden were talking. There was a direct question to Donald Trump about mass deportation. And while he wanted to talk endlessly about nativist and anti-immigrant attack lines, he refused to answer the question about mass deportation. Why? Because what they're putting forward, what they're waving in those signs at the RNC, as we've talked about, is a plan to deport dreamers. And if you look at the large vast of the American people, when given the choice between a massive mass deportation regime and providing pathways to legal status for our undocumented neighbors, overwhelmingly and consistently, there is a choice for the pathways to legalization. And so I think what we can see here, right, is a continuation that we need to be able to raise the salience of these concerning policies. As Lex, I think you were talking about, and I heard in your voice about the real concern and urgency that we have if these policies were implemented. And I think elevating that as much as possible over the next several months about the real choice and stakes of this election between a radical remaking of our immigration system versus a need for real solutions that address the really very real challenges of forced global migration, of the challenges of dealing with immigration. Those challenges are real, and I think we can have a debate to be able to solve those. But I think the collection of what we've seen here in the Project 2025 and what's on offer from the Trump administration, or not administration, sorry, their campaign, is something that is well beyond that point of view. And I think continuing to elevate those conversations, I think we can put pressure on some media outlets to cover better, but I think there is plenty of other outlets online in your own sphere of influence, your own spaces, to be able to raise these concerns as well.
So let's talk about some of these specific policies. Since you brought up DACA, in the Project 2025 paper, they call DACA an unlawful program. And according to your organization, America's Voice, Project 2025 calls for the elimination of DACA. I mean, how would that work in practice?
Well, I mean, I think in practice, what it would mean is be ending the program, and whether that, we will see about the kind of specifics of what that would mean. But I think what's really important is that the details of how, I think it's best we not figure that out. Because I think we're going to be in a different situation where people who came to the United States as children, who have been building their lives over the last decade plus in the United States, contributing to our country in so many various and different ways, that what is on offer here is about stripping those of protections, rounding those people up with a show me your papers force, and then deporting those folks to countries that they may not even remember living in, let alone speaking some of the language. And I think that is really what is really important here, is that it is in the details. The old kind of phrase, the devil is in the details, and that is very much the case here with some of the Project 2025 pieces, which is looking at the policies and the protections that they want to strip, not only for those like DACA, but also eliminating other pathways for legal status. And I think what's important here is that for the rhetoric that is being used, that this is somehow an illegal process, is that whether or not people come and are on the process to get legal status or to get citizenship, increasingly what we are hearing is that it doesn't matter that status. It is, if you are a black immigrant, or you're from Latin America, well, then that to them is an illegal immigrant, quote unquote. And I think that kind of conflation is extremely concerning. And I think ones we'll start to see more and more of, even beyond some of the specific policy changes that we'll see.
And Cecilia, in the paper that Niskanen Center put out, you all cite that over 500,000 young adults are protected by DACA. 176,000 Ukrainians have fled to the United States. Without staff to process applications and renewals, these individuals would be unable to obtain or renew their legal protection or work authorization. You also say that the mandate directs the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration staff to abandon refugee vetting in favor of addressing the situation at the southern border. Refugees are the most thoroughly screened individuals admitted to the U.S., so the refugee program would essentially cease to exist without any staff dedicated to the vetting process? I mean, is this legal?
Yeah, so reality is that they have this idea of eliminating some of these programs that, as Zachary mentioned, they call DACA recipients unlawful. They call the program unlawful. And so they have this idea to eliminate all of these programs. But some of them, may be caught up in litigation. This is what we're facing with DACA, that, maybe a decision comes down from the Supreme Court in 2026. But realistically, they can't end these programs entirely on their own. They might get pushback from Congress or from the, judicial branch. However, what they can do is control their staff, and what their staff does, your manager tells you what you can and cannot spend your time on, and that's what they intend to do with these programs. So they say that in order to push attention to other matters, they will not allow their staff to work on these so-called unlawful programs, which they have defined to include things like DACA and Uniting for Ukraine, the Ukrainian private sponsorship program. So this means for anyone who's looking to renew their status under this, like I said, over 500,000 DACA recipients right now are protected by the program. They have to renew this status regularly. But if they send in their application because the next administration hasn't managed to stop it yet, the program from existing. So they still send their applications, but there's just no staff dedicated or able or permitted to spend their time reviewing and approving it, which means slowly over time, those individuals would fall out of status and lose their ability to continue to stay and, have protections and legal work authorization in this country. And so they do that for Uniting for Ukraine. They say that for the DACA program, and they also say that for refugees. In that situation, it's not actually the applications, because this is looking at people who are in the refugee pipeline, perhaps referred from the United Nations, the Human Rights on Refugees population group. And they're referred to the Populations, Refugees, and Migration Bureau for vetting, because these individuals are highly vetted. We have to look into their background, who they're associated with, and these kinds of things. But if there's no one to do that job, then the refugee program kind of ceased to exist, because no one else can enter the U.S. under this program without being thoroughly vetted by those staff. And so what they can't do is, eliminate the refugee program without congressional involvement. But what they can do is find loopholes and ways to, leverage this power they'll have over staff through the politicization of the federal government, in order to ensure that the individuals who would normally be tasked with making sure that program functions on a day-to-day basis are not able to dedicate their time and resources to doing so.
I think it's so important that we remember we're talking about human beings here. I mean, they talk about immigrants like they're not human beings. I was thinking a lot about farm workers and putting this show together. We have 1 million farm workers doing backbreaking work in California. I mean, they have to inhale. We've got fires going on. I smelled a lot of smoke yesterday in Sonoma County. They have to inhale this smoke. It's so hot out there. About 60% of farm workers in California are undocumented. How would Project 2025 affect them? Cecilia, you all write that the H-2A and H-2B visa programs are essential employment programs that fill temporary and seasonal gaps in agricultural and non-agricultural labor markets. There's a lot of details about what Project 2025 would do. Ultimately, if these plans were implemented, the agricultural industry would be hit particularly hard by these policies, losing up to 10% of its already stretched thin workforce, or even larger shares on some farms. What would this do specifically to farm workers who are already living in fear, in many cases because they're undocumented?
Sure. I think the H-2A program is one of our few options that we have for someone who might be considered low skill or kind of in these manual labor positions to come and work legally in the U.S. And so they are working oftentimes alongside individuals who are without status. But the H-2A, if we no longer have it or we're no longer able to use it because of the restrictions in Project 2025, which again, they aren't able to fully eliminate the program without congressional involvement, but there are ways that they can create loopholes and leverage the power that they do have to really make the program unusable, which would put a lot of pressure on the undocumented populations that are already, working in these conditions. If, you're losing 10% or more of your workforce, I mean, ultimately we might see rising food prices or other pressures on the undocumented population that would be subject to other measures that are described in Project 2025, including these deportation measures. So farm workers are one of the more popular visa programs across the board. And yet, this is because obviously everyone has to eat. We all have food that we would like to have on our table at the end of the day. But this really could have pretty devastating effects on both populations, those with a legal temporary visa like the H-2A or farm workers who are undocumented.
And what would you add, Zachary? I feel like we almost barely scratched the surface here when it comes to immigration and Project 2025. How else would these plans affect the most vulnerable? undocumented immigrants in this country?
Yeah, I think, we can see from this is not just a plan to go after all undocumented community, whether no matter how long they've been inside the United States, whether kind of protected status that they have had before. So I think this is about for new arrivals and also the long settled parts of the community. And so I think that is one piece of this, but I think also the other piece is the elimination of any new sorts of legal entry points that would be eliminated, and because for many families, they come from mixed status families. And so this isn't just about the immediate undocumented community who may lack immigration status, but it is also their family members and friends who would be, and their communities who would be deprived of the contributions, of the friendship, of the personal connections from this sort of roundup that would exist. And I think, you talked a little bit about some of again, we're talking about our neighbors. We're talking about our fellow human beings here. And I think what is really, important for us to think about in this moment is the sort of dehumanizing rhetoric that comes when talking about immigrants in this political cycle, and that we'll see at exponential levels over the next several months. I mean, we track a lot of the political ads, and, we've already identified that they're through an agency called Ad Impact, identified that there is also $260 million already being spent this year alone on negative anti-immigrant ads. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those ads have a lot of dehumanizing rhetoric. So whether or not everybody is seeing that kind of thing on a daily basis, I think it is really important for us to think about how we are talking about these issues, because reasonable people can disagree about the level of immigration, about our immigration policy, about how best to manage our systems. That's what we have in a democracy. But when we use rhetoric that dehumanizes people, that creates a level of threats to our democracy, about threats to our public safety, with that level of dehumanization of this of a particular group, we put things at serious risk. We're no longer talking about the policies themselves. And so the policies outlined in Project 2025 that we talked about today have serious consequences. But there are real public safety concerns when talking about the rhetoric, the dehumanization overall. And we're coming up on this weekend was the 5-year anniversary, or the 5-year marker of the attack in El Paso, where 23 people were murdered because a man believed there was a quote unquote Hispanic invasion. And that sort of dehumanizing rhetoric really is out here. And I think not only about the particular conditions of the legal status of the community, but I think it's also important to think about that sort of dehumanizing rhetoric that's in the political sphere creates conditions that are really concerning for all Americans.
I think this is so important to talk about at a time when we're seeing people at the RNC, as Trump is talking about a mass deportation plan, cheering and yelling and waving these mass deportation now signs. As Cecilia, or one of our callers said, I don't think I saw many Native Americans in that hall. And people really just need to think about where they come from and their history and what it means to hold a mass deportation now sign. As you say, Zachary, we can disagree on this issue, but just to have some respect for these people. We have just about a minute left. To that point, Zachary, it sounds like based on this massive ad buy, things are going to get even uglier. It's almost hard to comprehend that, given how ugly they are now. How do you think media should deal with some of these ugly ads and the racist rhetoric that we are sure to hear in the coming months leading up to the election?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, if I were given a magic wand, what I would like to see over the next several, months around immigration is, one, I think there is a lot of candidates that are down ballot. Many are on the Republican side running in important battleground races. I think there's a lot of questions to be asked. And if reporters are in a position to do that, ask about the details. Do they support the mass deportation? Do they support another state's National Guard coming on and rounding up the community that they are supposed to represent? Is there any difference or daylight in condemning the sort of rhetoric that we are hearing, rhetoric that, news organizations have identified as like linked and associated with Nazi Germany, like whether that be about the poisoning of the blood, talking about immigrants, is there any other Republicans who are going to be vocal in pushing back on that sort of thing? Is there a space for that? And the second thing I would say is, I think in this particular moment, thinking about some of the details and also putting in context. When I think we've been tracking this, is an increased use of this great replacement theory rhetoric when talking about immigrants or talking about them as an quote unquote invading force. That needs to always be put in context, even if elected officials or people in prominent positions are using that rhetoric. That rhetoric is inexorably linked to deadly political violence and threats to our democracy. And I think, yes, there is fact checks that need to be happening. Yes, there needs to be pushback overall. But I think for the media and particularly some of that initial context to help the American people and their readers understand how this rhetoric is linked and how it is dangerous to public safety is critically important over the next several months, as we're going to continue to see an avalanche of dehumanizing and anti-immigrant rhetoric over the next several months.
And it's important to note that even if Trump does not win in November, another theme on these Project 2025 shows is that what they are outlining in Project 2025 could potentially, and in some cases already, have been implemented at the state level. A couple months ago in the Miami Herald, there was an op-ed by Silvana Caldera called "Florida's Increasingly Anti-Immigrant Policies Hurt All of Us." So no matter what happens, it's very important to have conversations about what is in Project 2025. Zachary Mueller is Senior Research Director for America's Voice. Cecilia Esterline is Immigration Research Analyst at the Niskanen Center. Thank you both for your work, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. You can read Project 2025 online. It's project2025.org. You can find all of our Project 2025 shows at kalw.org. Click news and then your call. Thanks to Kevin Vance for engineering today's show, and thank you for joining us. I'm Rose Aguilar. It's your call.